Hello, Christopher Michaud, Town of Dartmouth, Director of Public Health. Today we're here to talk about composting. And composting is something that many of you may be doing in your own personal properties. But what we're talking about today is large-scale commercial composting. The reason why we want to talk about large-scale commercial composting, and not just here in Dartmouth, but more statewide, is because composting has been billed largely by Mass DEP as being a benefit of waste reduction, because our landfill space in Massachusetts is greatly diminishing. And we do not need to dispose of organics forever by putting them in landfills. However, there are other unintended consequences from commercial composting. And this recent proposal by Mass DEP with Title V, those regulations that Mass DEP promulgates, is what brings us here today. Because they're focusing on people here in southeastern Massachusetts, Cape Cod and the island. And they're saying that the septic systems for those properties are polluting our embayments. Nitrogen is a known pollutant. And yes, nitrogen is a component of wastewater from septic systems. So they wanted to blame the homeowners and as well as the towns. They are only talking about wastewater, but nitrogen has many, many sources. Compost being one of them, particularly the large-scale commercial composting. You can see many windrows, and you don't see any stormwater controls, any engineering controls at this large-scale site. Many of the pictures that you're going to see here today are cropped, because what we don't want to do is blame the people that are composting large scale, because the state has failed to provide adequate requirements, both in engineering, oversight, and testing, to assure that these compost sites are protective of the environment and the public health. So what is Mass DEP doing about composting? They're promoting it. They're promoting composting since the early part of around 2014 by changing their regulations to promote waste bans. Now, what is a waste ban? A waste ban is when they say you cannot throw away certain recyclables, that it can't be permanently disposed of. So around 2014, they created a threshold of 2,000 pounds per week. So if you're a generator of food waste or organic waste in the amount of 2,000 pounds per week, then that had to go to composting, anaerobic digestion, diversion, animal feed, for example. So much of this waste down here in southeastern Mass comes to large-scale commercial composting. In 2018, at the Dartmouth Town Hall, we advised Mass DEP of recent water testing that we had done at a composting site. And we will show you the results of that later. Mass DEP acknowledged that it looks like there's a problem. And what have they done since that time? So as you'll see, in November of 2022, they are further promoting large-scale composting by dropping that threshold from 2,000 pounds per week to 1,000. So more waste materials will be generated away from permanent disposal at landfills to compost operations, anaerobic digestion, or diversion to animal feed. Here is the first one that we would like you to take a look at. This is a composting operation here in southeastern Massachusetts on the banks of an impaired estuary. And as you can see in the picture, there are 3 distinct channels running towards the salt marsh, where runoff from the compost pile is directly entering the estuary. This is a site that doesn't have any permits that the state is aware of, and it continues to exist some 4 years after it was first discovered. What you'll see here next is another compost site in Massachusetts. You'll see a cold weather photo and a warm weather photo. you'll see the various ponds down gradient of the compost site. Look at the color of those ponds. These pictures are taken from Google Earth, and you can go and look them up yourself and see this exact image. This one's along a major watercourse, a major river here in Massachusetts. You can see that the watercourse pretty much wraps around this site. And in the cold weather photo, you don't see any impacts. But yeah, in the warm weather photo, as you can see that the water starts to recede in some of the old river channels, you see bright green, like we did in that slide with Mass DEP when they wanted to talk about the changes to Title V. So we've got green water right against compost sites twice. With septic systems, we have to site our septic systems certain distances from sensitive areas. But as you're seeing here, it seems like we're putting these compost sites right up against some of our most sensitive environmental receptors. Here is another compost site in Massachusetts. You can see that off to the lower right corner, there is a little brown spot, and then if you follow that, you can see where the water trails down to another river. This is the cold weather photo, and now we have the warm weather photo. Bright green once again. This is only a cropped image from Google Earth, and it is not altered in any way. That is the color. Here is another photo of another composting site in Massachusetts. This is a cold weather photo. You can see the dark spot, which is a water body, and then in the next photo, you'll see that that is bright green once again. So here we have yet another photo of a compost site in Massachusetts. And this is the watercourses without any impacts. And again, a discolored water body in the warm weather, down gradient of the composting area. Here we have another one where we have a water body to the right, down gradient. And in the warm weather, we can see that the perimeter of the pond is green. This is a photo that we took, the town of Dartmouth. This is a pond that was down gradient of a composting operation. As you can see in the photo, the water has a sheen on it. This was taken in the wintertime. The sheen is from the runoff from the compost. It was believed to be fats from the food waste that was going into the compost piles. This is a picture of that same pond in the summertime, bright green. We got permission to sample that pond, and as you'll see in the highlighted row, you can see some numbers there. And those numbers are for the total nitrogen. As we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of concern about nitrogen. It is a known pollutant. And Mass DEP has certain regulations that if you're discharging pollutants to the groundwater, whether it be point source or non-point source, in many instances, that is regulated under 314 CMR 5. The town of Dartmouth requested of Mass DEP on August 28, 2022, the groundwater discharge permits for composting operations. Their response was none. But as you saw in the earlier frames, there is clearly point source discharge and non-point source discharge of pollutants. You'll see by this highlighted row that there are many numbers there. You're going to see the south pond column. That was a cross-gradient pond that we checked to try to get the ambient or the background level of total nitrogen that would be expected in the environment. We also tested leachate pools on that compost site that were draining into the groundwater. Those levels that you see of 91 in the pond are equivalent to that of a septic tank. It was the town that had to take enforcement to shut this operation down. And part of our enforcement, we required the removal of the composting materials. Not a dwindling down and phasing out, but a removal to stop the pollution. But composting may have other impacts on public health. So in this document that you'll see here, Mass DEP has issued a notice of responsibility to an operation that resulted in PFAS, those forever compounds that are a concern with human health, being sourced from the composting operation. This goes back to what was mentioned earlier, where we mentioned that there are no engineering controls, there is no adequate oversight at these operations. You fill out a permit, there's no groundwater monitoring like we have at our landfills, there's no third-party inspection like we have at our landfills. The only thing that they tell people that obtain these general permits is, shall not have an unpermitted discharge. If we were doing testing for constituents from these organics that are going onto these properties and then bleeding out liquids and rainfall running through these piles, picking up some of these constituents and then running them off into the environment, if these forever compounds sourced from this composting operation, that could have gotten picked up earlier, and it didn't. We also know that composting has created public safety issues. This past summer, we ended up with fires locally in Middleborough, as well as fires at an organics handling facility in Ashby. This creates air quality issues and endangers the public safety. Not only our public safety personnel, but also nearby residents that live next to these if these fires were to get out of control. We also know here in Dartmouth that many residents had been impacted by odor, nuisance odor from composting facilities. I know that that has occurred elsewhere in the state. Here is a document of Mass DEP that we'd also like you to see. Because this document, and you'll see in the highlight below, it talks about the formation of certain compounds that are regulated in Massachusetts under the Massachusetts Contingency Plan. That is the regulations and statute that pertains to hazardous waste. This document is from a release site in which they discovered acetones and other compounds associated with the composting. The composting created an environment by which these formed naturally. Mass DEP is aware of this because this is a document taken right from their website. So again, we have byproducts and environmental conditions that are being created that are jeopardizing the public health, our drinking water. Many of these composting facilities are located in remote areas not served by public drinking water. We know about the air quality issues from the smoke, poorly managed compost creating nuisance conditions, but more importantly, for these Title V changes, the nitrogen and pollution. And we also know that from the earlier slide where phosphorus is also a source in the testing that we conducted. We asked Mass DEP if they've ever conducted any testing at any of the organics handling facilities, composting facilities, and they have no data. So what we would like you to do is, consider all of this information, because with these Title V changes, we're strictly looking at septic systems. And we're blaming homeowners for polluting. And what we've shown here today is that composting is clearly not being regulated properly in Massachusetts. Mass DEP has the authority under 310 CMR 1600 as well as under 314 CMR 5. And they're choosing not to issue these groundwater discharge permits to these sites. They are racing ahead with regulations to change Title V, but yet they're not racing ahead with regulations to change 310 CMR 1600, which are the solid waste regulations that allow all of this. You'll oftentimes hear me say that we've deregulated composting in Massachusetts. Because if you wanted to compost in Massachusetts back in the 90s, it would have required site assignment, which is a very rigorous oversight process that occurs both at the local level, at town hall or city hall, as well as at the state with Mass DEP. Now you can get a general permit, and if you're agricultural, you can get a registration by filling out a form and not subjecting yourself to third-party monitoring and environmental testing like we have at our landfills that remain in Massachusetts. These are critical. We also have to have a Mass DEP that is at the table with regulating nitrogen and not just with septic systems. They should be taking a very parallel track and swiftly modifying their regulations to address this new source of pollution here in Massachusetts, and as I believe we've shown throughout Massachusetts. This is an environmental tragedy, and it must stop. If you're concerned about what you've seen here today, you can contact the Governor's Constituency Hotline at the number shown, as well as contacting the Secretary of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs and the Acting Commissioner of Mass DEP, and demand that we swiftly protect the environment and the public health. Because Mass DEP was quick to show us the slide of green water to protect the environment, only after which they were being sued for their failure to address nitrogen earlier. And while we can see the effects that we've shown here today on our other parts of Massachusetts with ponds that are green, we must not forget about the public health, because we cannot see what's happening to our drinking water. But we know about the investigation that Mass DEP is conducting. We know about the release site. And we know that Mass DEP is not changing their regulations to address the unknowns from composting. So please, contact your elected officials and demand equity in the protection of the environment, and more importantly, the protection of public health. Thank you.